Hello and welcome to episode 11 of the Yes You Coaching podcast. I'm your host, Anna Manning, the owner and founder of Yes You Coaching and all-round confidence coach who is not feeling particularly confident today. And I'm going to share this with you because I think it's important. I spent a good day doing things, then I had a walk and I went out for lunch. And then I just came back from my laptop and for some reason, don't know why, probably not going to inquire too much. My brain's having a little moment where it's like, oh my God, you're so embarrassing. As if you're still trying to do all this stuff. As if you're just writing everything down in these notebooks and like making this podcast. Oh my God. Right? Me, the confidence coach that tells other people about this stuff. That is what my brain chose to come up with today. Now, admittedly, it doesn't do that very often anymore, but it still does it. So if yours does that all the time and really gives you the runaround, just know that's normal and there's nothing wrong with you. And there are things you can do about it. But if you're a normal human with a normal human brain, you are going to have these kinds of thoughts that make your life just feel a bit difficult. Anyway, that's me. I'm recording the podcast for you now, and I think it's going to be a good one because today we're talking about how to create good culture on the inside. So when we think about workplace culture or the culture of a place, and it's generally accepted now, this is a really important thing. Like if you're going somewhere and you're going to get a job, you're like, I want to know what the culture's like. Because it's important and it really colours your experience of being and working in a place. But I don't want to talk about it from the external perspective, as is so often with the stuff that I talk about. I want to talk about it from the internal perspective. I'm going to lead you through a bit of an exploration as to how you create good culture for yourself on the inside, rather than thinking about the kind of culture that you're working in on the outside. And yes, that's important too. But the reason I'm doing this episode is because I see and I coach many people who would say, oh, it's a good culture where I work. It is a good culture. My boss is really supportive, Yeah, it's good. But they don't feel as confident as they want to because their internal culture, quite frankly, is pretty toxic. It's not the kind of culture that you'd want to work in. If it was replicated on the outside, you'd be like, Jesus, that place sounds terrible. So it's really important to think about whether you're getting your internal culture right. And this is especially if you have moments at work where you don't feel as confident as you want to. I will bet you money, quite a bit of money, that your internal culture could use some work. So, first off, what is culture? And there's many definitions, right? Look on Google, there's hundreds, but I saw a good one that I liked, and it says to talk about culture is to talk about how people go about their work, how people think and how they behave. And that was from NHS England. So it's not the written down rules, it's not the policies, it's the other things that happen. It's the way people go about their work. It's how people think and it's how they behave. And I want you to think for a second about what type of culture creates well-being at work. What type of culture would you like to work within? Most people can answer this fairly easily. And if I think about this, obviously I work for myself now, right? So I create my own culture. But if I'm within an organization, I want to work in a culture where people are fairly open, people are fairly transparent, there isn't really rigid hierarchies. I want to work in a culture where you can try new things, where you can innovate, where it's okay if you make a mistake and you don't get sold down the river if you make a mistake, but actually, yeah, there'll be accountability, but somebody's going to support you, somebody's going to help you. I work in a kind of culture that is tolerant and that's professional, right? That's understanding. Not one where people are yelling and screaming at each other. Not one where people are being bullying or snarky or rude. Not one where nobody's ever given any acknowledgement or credit for the work that they do. Not one where people are given so much work and given, such high standards to complete the work by that they end up shot through with fear. No, you want to work somewhere where there's an appropriate amount of work. The standards are appropriate based on what you know and what you've got time to do. That you're appropriately supported, that you're trained, that you're handled correctly when there's a mistake. All of that, right? All of that is the kind of culture that I want to work in on the outside, the external culture. All of that, if it's right, it will add to my sense of well-being at work. If it's wrong, I am not going to have well-being at work. I'm not going to feel good about work, regardless of how great the job is or the job title is, or regardless of how much I'm getting paid. If all of that other stuff is wrong, it's going to feel pretty bad. And it will impact on my confidence. So that's the external. And right, some of you have probably worked in a place where the culture was pretty shit. Some of you might work in a place where the culture is really good. But that's the external culture. And what I want us to think about now is, how is that reflected on the inside? The most important culture that you work within is the one that is within your own head and your own body and your own mind. That is the culture that is with you 24/7. Even when you close your laptop, even when you log off, that culture exists. Even at 3 o'clock in the morning when you wake up, your boss is nowhere in sight, you don't have to do any work. Your workplace culture can still exist in your own head, right? Your internal culture still exists. And I want to share 5 kind of components that I think of in terms of good culture. And then we're going to go through those in a bit of detail so you can really think about, all right, what is my internal culture like? Is it good? Is it bad? Is there areas that are good? Is there areas that I want to change? So the 5 components of this, the first one is how you are spoken to. Number 2 is what happens when mistakes or failures occur. Number 3 is like the level of encouragement when you're doing new things or you're finding something tricky, like encouragement and support. Number 4 is support on hard days or through hard times. And number 5 is being acknowledged and recognized. Now, there are loads of components of good culture, but when I look at them all, I basically boiled them down, and a lot of them fall within these 5 elements. So we're going to look at them in turn. I'm going to get you to think about whether your internal culture is good or pretty bad in relation to these components. So number 1, how are you spoken to? Important part of your work life, right? You want to be spoken to with respect. You want to be spoken to with patience. You want people to be professional. You want people to be open. You don't want people to be rude, right? That's how you want to be spoken to in terms of your workplace, in terms of the culture of your workplace. So when we reflect that on the inside, the question is, how are you speaking to yourself? Right? Are you very respectful of yourself? Are you always professional? Are you always speaking to yourself with kindness and with compassion and with patience? Most of us know that we want all of these things from the people who are speaking to us. But when it comes to how we speak to ourselves, different story. If most of you spoke to yourself, hang on, let me rephrase this. If your boss spoke to you in the way that you speak to yourself, you would probably quit. That voice in your head that's like, oh, you're totally going to mess this up, right? Look at me at the beginning of this podcast. Imagine if my boss had said to me, "Oh my God, you're so embarrassing," as if you're still trying to do this podcast and like writing all these things down in these notebooks. Imagine that. Would I stay in that job? Well, I might if I really need the money, but it would be awful if that was my experience of that, if that was my workplace culture, that people spoke to each other like that. If they were harsh, if they were demanding, if they were critical, if they were rude. But how often are you that for yourself? And I want you to think about this, like maybe give yourself a score out of 5. How closely does the way I speak to myself match up with the way I want other people to speak to me? What is my internal culture like in terms of how I speak to myself? I reckon mine's about a 4 now. But I tell you what, it used to be like a 1. Very terrible. How's yours? What are you giving yourself out of 5? I didn't know I was going to turn this into a quiz, but here we are. Number 2 is around what happens when you fail or make a mistake. Now, the reason that this is an important part of culture is because it's inevitable. Nobody can get everything perfect all the time. There's going to be days where you fuck up. There's going to be days where you fail. There's going to be times where you make a mistake. So, what kind of environment do you want to be in when the inevitable happens and something goes wrong? Do you want to be in a kind of environment where you are, well, I call it being sold down the river. I used to work in healthcare litigation. And what unfortunately you would sometimes see when something went wrong in a healthcare setting was that a particular individual might be scapegoated, is the word I'm going to use, pointed at. Oh, it was that nurse over there that got everything wrong. Yeah. Let's ignore all the other stuff around the edges. Let's ignore the fact that they'd been awake for 36 hours. Let's ignore the fact that there weren't enough people on shift. Let's ignore all the systemic factors. Let's just point at an individual and blame them. What is your internal culture like when you fail or when you make a mistake? We instinctively know how we want to be treated by other people when we fail and when we make a mistake. We want the environment to be open enough so that we can actually come out and say, I have messed up here. I've made a mistake. And maybe you can rectify it, or maybe you need help. But you want the culture to be good enough, to be open enough that you know you can come and say, I've made a mistake. This has gone really wrong. You might be afraid, but at least you know you can say it. And then you want the culture to be supportive enough to be like, okay, Anna, let's have a look. Let's sit down and have a think about this. Let's see what we can do. You want somebody to support you, maybe in rectifying that situation, maybe in dealing with other people that need to be notified, right? Whatever it is. And then you want that ongoing support to keep you kind of mentally on the right track, to keep you motivated, to keep you encouraged, and to keep you trying. Again, I'm going to talk about healthcare because that's the culture that I've seen so much of throughout my career. And one of the things that we used to see, really sadly, with when people made a mistake in healthcare was that they might quit their job completely. And that might be because the culture was terrible and it really didn't, and there really was no support for them when they made a mistake. But it might also be because their internal culture was terrible. So even if you're in a culture where your external culture is okay, like you can make a mistake, it's not great, but all right, Your boss isn't going to yell at you. They're going to be like, okay, how do we fix this? What do we do? You can still be in a position where your internal culture is so bad and so so failure intolerant that you quit your job completely. Like, look at those people in healthcare. I bet some of them worked in an environment where actually it was, they'd made a mistake. All right, yeah, there's insurance, there's support, fine. But some of them will have been in the situation where what's going on inside their head is so bad that they can no longer tolerate being in that environment. So how do you treat yourself when you make a mistake? Are you supportive of yourself? Are you accepting? Do you keep encouraging yourself? Are you allowed to learn from that mistake and pick yourself up and try again? Or do you endlessly remind yourself of it? Do you beat yourself up mentally? Do you continually ruminate over it? Well, that's what most of us do when we make a mistake. And what happens if your internal culture is really bad around failure or mistakes is that you make every situation really high pressure. So when you're going into something, you're shit terrified of making a mistake because you know you're going to beat yourself up afterwards. This is even harder for people who would call themselves perfectionists or have really high standards. They can't make a mistake because then it means that they're not perfect and they have to be perfect. Right? Imagine the pressure. Imagine you're in an external environment where they're like, mistakes will not be tolerated. You will be fired. You will be condemned. If you've got a really terrible internal culture around failure or making mistakes, that is literally what you're doing to yourself. So I'm going to ask you to score yourself out of 5 here. How good is your internal culture when you fail or when you make a mistake? Right? Are you really supportive and encouraging, and you give yourself a space, you give yourself the time, you're able to learn from it, you're able to bounce back? That would be really good. 5. Are you critical, angry, the complete opposite? Ruminating, endlessly beating yourself up over it, not letting yourself, never letting it go? 0. What's your score? I think mine's probably a 3 on this one. I don't think I'm as good at this. Maybe this is an area for me to work on too. All right, number 3. This is, what is your internal culture like when you're doing something new or you're finding something tricky? Because let's face it, your culture doesn't need to be amazing when you're just doing stuff that's fine. It's your everyday, day to day. Feel confident with what you're doing. You know how to handle things. Yeah, that's all right. That's good. In that moment, you don't need that much great culture. You don't need that much great support. But where good culture is even more handy is when you're doing something new or you're finding something tricky. What kind of environment do you want to be in when this is the case for you? So I know that if my boss had given me some work and it was something new and or I was finding something tricky, I would maybe want them to give me a bit more space. I'd maybe want them to give me a bit more time. And I would maybe want them to kind of allow me to do a bit of a shitty first draft. I would maybe want the standard to be lower than 100%, right? Maybe can we aim for a 50% first time? Because all of that is going to create an environment where I can actually give something a go and I don't completely freeze up because I'm so terrified that I can't do it and I don't know how and it's all going to go wrong, right? I don't freeze. I'm like, okay, well, I'll put my growth mindset glasses on. I give this a go. I'll give it my best shot. I want lots of encouragement, lots of support. That is the best way when I'm doing something new or I'm finding something tricky, that I can kind of be confident enough to just give it a go. I find with some of the clients that I work with, their internal culture around this particular issue is pretty bad. So many people will find themselves procrastinating with stuff they don't really feel like they know how to do that easily. Maybe it's a new piece of work, maybe it's slightly different from something you've done before, or maybe it's something you just think, oh, that's going to be really hard. And the reason that you're procrastinating is because there's something going through your head like, oh God, you're not going to be able to do this. You're going to mess this up. This is so hard. Like, I can't do it. I'm going to, all of that, yada, 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 yada. And imagine if your boss was saying all that stuff to you. They handed you a piece of work and they were like, oh my God, this is so hard. You're not going to be able to do it. You're going to mess it up. How would you would feel terrible. Your confidence would be low. You wouldn't even want to attempt the piece of work. Well, that's exactly what's happening when your internal culture stinks in this regard. You don't even want to attempt the piece of work because you've already decided, or somebody's already decided you can't do it, you're going to mess it up. And what you'll find is that you procrastinate, you push it to the edge of your desk, you just don't want to do it. It's just that one thing. Just drags on and on and on. So if you find yourself doing that, think about what is your internal culture like in relation to when you're doing something new or finding something tricky. Are you more supportive in those moments? Do you give yourself a lot of encouragement? Right? Do you really help to schedule it in and break it down and give yourself a time scale, like all of those things you would want from somebody else? Do you do that? Or do you basically tell yourself that you're a piece of shit that just can't do it? And then end up procrastinating. If that's you, you can give yourself a 0 for this area. I'm going to give myself a 3 again here. But a 5, an internal culture, a 5 would be like, okay, I'm doing something new and tricky here. This might be difficult for me, but I know I can do this. I've done other stuff before. I can succeed. It's okay if I do a shitty first draft. I can keep going. Maybe I'll just make myself a cup of tea and I'm going to come back to it. I can definitely do this. What an amazing culture to have inside. That's the culture you want outside. And there's a reason for it. It's because it'll give you enough confidence to actually do something new or persevere when something's really hard. So what score are you giving yourself in this area? All right. On to number 4. Support on hard days. What is your internal culture like around this? Now, you know what you want from an external culture on a hard day. You want someone to acknowledge that you're having a hard day. You want someone to notice. You want someone to validate what you're feeling. You want someone to maybe give you a bit of support, maybe make you a cup of tea, maybe go and buy you some sweets at lunchtime. Maybe someone offers to lend a hand. Maybe someone says, can you actually work today? Is this a good idea? Do you need to sit under a blanket? We've all had a really hard day at work. You've probably had more than one. How you handle yourself on those hard days is so important because on those hard days, you're more vulnerable than you are on the days which aren't hard. It's fine on the days where you're just like skipping and you're really productive and you can get everything done, like brilliant. Good. On those days, who cares about the culture, right? You've got your own great culture going on. But it's on those hard days where that culture becomes really, really important, where you really need a boss that notices that you're having a hard day, where you really need a colleague that's like, tell me what's happening. And you've got the space and the time to tell them. And they listen to you and they care about you and they speak to you kindly and they see if they can help you. So let's take this inside. How do you support yourself on hard days? There is an entire podcast episode about this you can find if you search through. And it's called How to Feel Better on a Bad Day. Because most of us are really terrible at doing this. Most people tell me, oh, I just kind of try to ignore it. I try to power through. I tell myself I'm being ridiculous. That's how we take care of ourselves. We know that we want taken care of by other people completely differently. We know we want space and acceptance and validation and all those things, support. But we don't take care of ourselves like that on a hard day. So what would your internal culture look like if it was really good at supporting you on hard days? Would it rearrange your diary a little bit so that it wasn't so packed? Would it give you an extra long lunch break? Would it put in the things that are a bit easier for you rather than the really hard things? Would it tell you you're being ridiculous and that you should just power through? Or would it give you a bit of acceptance? And when I say it, I mean you. You're the one that's creating this internal culture. So what do you want your internal culture to be like on hard days? And what's it like right now? What are you going to give yourself a score out of 10? I mean, out of 5. Let's keep this consistent. I'm going to ask you to give yourself a 0 if on hard days you don't even acknowledge it. You push it down. You're like, oh, power through. You're being ridiculous. You slap a happy thought on it. You tell yourself, think positive. Everyone thinks I'm going to tell them to think positive because I'm a life coach. I'm not. How infuriating would it be if on a really bad day someone was like, you should just think positive? You'd want to slap them. How invalidating of the experience that you're having, a human being on having a hard day. You need someone to cock their head onto one side and be like, oh, stroke your arm a bit. Do that for yourself. What does that look like if it was 5? So supportive of yourself on a hard day. You give yourself everything you would want from somebody else. I'm going to give myself a 4 on this. I do really well at this now. But it's taken a while. All right, number 5 is being acknowledged and recognized for what you do, for what you bring, for who you are. It's really important, and it's an important part of culture, that you get acknowledged for what you do and that you are recognized for what you do. And in a good culture, a good workplace culture, this happens. People are credited for the work that they do. They're acknowledged for the work that they do, and people celebrate each other. Do you do this for yourself? So many people that I work with squirm when I ask them to acknowledge themselves for something. They physically squirm, and I can see them because we're on Zoom. And they get good at it in the end. But is your internal culture acknowledging you for what you do and for who you are and for what you've been through and for why you are where you are? Are you recognizing the good work that you do on a daily basis? Are you giving yourself a little high five? Are you saying, do you know what, well done you at the end of the day? If not, why not? This is part of good internal culture. If you want it from other people, if you want it on the outside, then bring it to yourself. You deserve it. You deserve to have the best cheerleader ever inside you. The one that's like, yeah, come on, you nailed that. How much nicer would that be than having somebody who either is critical of what you do, or even if you do something good, it just kind of skips over and is like, well, that's your job anyway. Imagine that. All right, that's what I've got for you in terms of creating good culture on the inside. Think about those 5 different aspects, rate yourself out of 5, and then think about areas where you could improve and give yourself a better internal culture. It will help you to feel more confident and to do better at work. Last thing, we still have spots left on the Confident at Work program. This is a small group training and coaching program, especially for women who want to grow their confidence at work. If you want to create a good internal culture, because that is what will build your confidence, let me tell you now. Details are in the show notes. Book a consult. Talk to me about joining us. It's probably the best thing you'll ever do for your career. All right. Enjoy the rest of your day, everybody. And I hope and I wish you well in building a great workplace culture for yourself on the inside. Bye.